Hey guys, tonight we're going to do something simple. Something that doesn't involve wars, kings, or inbreeding. Well, not directly. So, dim the lights, get comfortable under your very own, probably not straw-filled blanket, and let's talk about something every human has done since the dawn of civilization. Sleep. Yes, the thing we all crave but never get enough of. The thing medieval people somehow managed to do while sharing a mattress with their entire family, 2 goats, and an alarming number of bedbugs. Because as it turns out, the history of beds and how people actually slept is one of those quiet, weirdly fascinating stories that sits right in the middle of comfort and chaos. Let's start at the top, medieval Europe. The first thing you notice when looking at historical beds is, well, they look tiny. Every time a museum puts a medieval bed on display, there's always one guy in the group who says, "Wow, people must have been shorter back then." And sure, maybe a little, but not that much. The truth is, the beds were short because people didn't lie down flat to sleep. That's right, medieval folks were sitting up like half-propped corpses in a Victorian painting. Imagine your bed right now, but you're kind of upright, half-dozing, with your knees bent and a bunch of heavy blankets pressing down on you. Cozy, right? Sort of. They believed lying completely flat was dangerous. It was a death position. People were genuinely afraid that sleeping flat would invite death itself to pay a visit, as if lying horizontal was some kind of mystical invitation to the Grim Reaper. So instead, they propped themselves up on pillows or bolsters. And speaking of pillows, those weren't just soft rectangles of fluff. They were basically long, cylindrical rolls filled with straw, wool, or sometimes peasants' regrets. You could rest your back or head on them, but comfort wasn't exactly the main priority. Now, who actually had beds in the first place? Spoiler, not everyone. If you were a medieval peasant, your bed might have been a pile of straw or hay spread out in a corner of your one-room house, maybe next to the hearth. Families slept together, parents, children, even servants or farmhands, because heat was precious, and human bodies are basically medieval radiators. Sometimes they'd cover the straw with rough linen sheets or animal skins, but don't imagine anything fancy. It was warm, sure, but also itchy, dusty, and alive with all sorts of crawling company. Fleas, lice, mites, possibly a neighbor's chicken. If you've ever thought your mattress needs replacing, just remember, it probably doesn't contain hay that's been reused for 3 winters. Now, in the grand halls of castles or monasteries, beds were a little more impressive. And by impressive, I mean massive, wooden, and suspiciously ornate. Rich folks treated their beds like thrones. In fact, for many, the bed was the centerpiece of the room. Think carved oak frames, silk curtains, and a canopy heavy enough to block out light and possibly oxygen. But those curtains weren't just decorative. They served a practical purpose too. Medieval castles were drafty and cold, so the heavy drapery helped trap warmth. Plus, privacy was, let's say, optional. Curtains gave you the illusion of being alone even when servants or guests were standing 2 feet away. And beds were also a status symbol. Nobles didn't just sleep in them, they received guests in them. Seriously, if you were someone important, people might visit you while you were in bed, sitting upright, fully dressed, casually discussing politics while surrounded by embroidered pillows and maybe a small dog. Because nothing says power than holding a meeting from your own mattress. Let's float a bit earlier, to the Middle Ages before the Renaissance started making things fancy. For much of medieval Europe, sleep was actually split into 2 parts. That's right, people didn't just go to bed and wake up once. They had something called first sleep and second sleep. Here's how it worked. You'd go to bed not long after sunset because, well, there wasn't much else to do once it got dark. You'd sleep for maybe 4 hours, then wake up in the middle of the night for about an hour or 2. During that time, people would pray, read, talk quietly, eat, have sex, or even visit neighbors. Then they'd go back to bed for their second sleep until dawn. And this wasn't considered weird. It was normal, even healthy. There are 15th century medical texts that actually recommend this pattern as the best way to rest the body and soul. It wasn't until the Industrial Revolution and artificial light that humans got used to the idea of sleeping straight through the night. So if you ever wake up at 3 a.m. and wonder why, you can blame medieval monks. Now let's talk about sleeping positions. In the early medieval world, there were actual rules, written and unwritten, about how you were supposed to lie in bed. Monks and nuns were told to sleep on their backs, hands crossed over their chests, like they were perpetually auditioning for their own tomb effigy. The idea was to maintain modesty and avoid, sinful thoughts. Peasants and families, on the other hand, had their own etiquette. Parents would usually sleep near the wall, with children toward the edge of the bed, partly for warmth, partly to keep babies from falling off. And yes, sometimes everyone shared one bed. In small cottages, space was limited, so families often slept side by side. Servants might curl up on the floor or squeeze into a corner if they were lucky. Travelers might share a bed with strangers at an inn. That's right. If you stopped for the night at a medieval tavern, there was a good chance you'd have to snuggle up with someone you didn't know. People didn't think much of it. Beds were expensive, and warmth was more important than boundaries. So, next time you complain about a crowded Airbnb, just be grateful your roommate isn't a medieval merchant with the flu. Speaking of inns and public sleeping, let's talk about who shared with who. In most medieval households, even the lord and lady didn't always sleep together. Despite all the romantic stories, noble marriages were about politics, not cuddles. It was common for them to have separate chambers or at least separate beds. When they did share a bed, it was often ceremonial. Think of royal bedchambers like small stages, a performance of intimacy for witnesses, attendants, and servants. Because yes, people watched. When a royal couple married, the bedding ceremony was a full event. The newlyweds were led to bed by priests and nobles who blessed the union, and then stayed long enough to make sure things were, let's say, officially underway. It's the kind of scene that makes you wonder how anyone ever managed to fall asleep again. Let's glide over to the 14th and 15th centuries when beds started to look more familiar. Mattresses were now stuffed with feathers instead of straw, if you could afford it. Linen sheets became softer and canopies grew taller and more elaborate. People even had bed testers, literally servants who would test your bed for you before you got in, checking for warmth, smoothness, or assassins. Because yes, assassination in bed was a thing. Medieval nobles loved a good poisoning or stabbing, preferably when their target was at their most relaxed. And so, bedchambers weren't just for sleeping. They were small fortresses of fabric and paranoia.
Let's pause for a sleepy fact. In medieval households, beds were the most valuable piece of furniture. When people made wills, they didn't just leave land or jewelry, they specifically listed their bed, the frame, the hangings, and even the sheets. Passing down a bed was a big deal, like leaving your family the Tesla of the 1300s. And for good reason. A well-made bed could cost as much as a cottage. The wood was carved by hand, the curtains embroidered, the linen woven from fine flax. A noblewoman's bed of estate was a literal display of wealth and taste. Meanwhile, the average villager still had a pile of hay and a prayer. Now, not all sleeping was done in beds. In monasteries, monks often slept in communal dormitories. No soft mattresses, no private curtains, just rows of wooden planks or simple straw pallets. They were expected to rise at midnight for prayers, so their first sleep ended early. In some stricter orders, monks slept sitting up in their robes to avoid the sin of sloth. Yes, sitting upright was considered holier. Nothing says devotion like chronic back pain. Nuns were often held to the same rules, though some convents quietly bent them. Records show that a few abbesses imported feather mattresses from Italy, pure luxury, and justified it as necessary for health. Because apparently, even in God's service, comfort finds a way. And what about night clothes? You might imagine medieval people in nightgowns or pajamas, but those didn't really exist yet. Most people slept naked or in their underclothes if they had company. Night shirts became common only in the later Middle Ages. For peasants, wearing your day clothes to bed was practical. It saved fabric and warmth. But for nobles, stripping down for sleep was part of the luxury. Sheets were considered cleaner than clothing. Ironically, those sheets weren't always washed very often, so make of that what you will. Let's float forward for a moment to the Renaissance and beyond, when beds became absurdly huge. By the 16th century, royal beds were like architectural structures. Henry VIII's famous bed, Great Bed of Ware, was so massive that it could fit at least 4 couples comfortably, which, honestly, tells you everything you need to know about Tudor sleepovers. That bed, by the way, became a tourist attraction. People would visit just to see how many bodies it could fit. Romantic, right? We'll pause here before we drift into the Renaissance and early modern sleeping rituals, the age of lace pillows, embroidered dreams, and candlelit insomnia. So, as you lie there in your 21st century mattress with memory foam and too many pillows, take a moment to appreciate it. Because once upon a time, comfort meant sharing straw with your family, sleeping half-sitting so death wouldn't notice you, and praying the fleas would pick someone else tonight. Sweet dreams, my friends.
The many people in one bed problem. So, picture this. It's late at night, somewhere around 1370. There's a dim little cottage on the edge of an English village. The fire's mostly ashes now, the smoke curling lazily toward the thatch roof. Inside, a family of 6 is preparing to go to bed. Now, if you're imagining everyone peacefully heading to their own bedrooms with fluffy duvets and privacy, forget it. Bedrooms weren't really a thing yet. For most medieval people, there was one main room for everything. You cooked there, worked there, and yes, slept there. And when it came to sleeping, you didn't do it alone. Because firewood was expensive, heating was bad, and privacy was overrated. Most families would pile into a single bed or onto piles of straw, with a few wool blankets if they were lucky. The parents, the kids, maybe a grandparent, sometimes even a visiting friend or servant. Everyone together, shoulder to shoulder, in what was affectionately called a family bed. If that sounds cozy, you probably haven't tried sleeping under one scratchy blanket while your father snores, your little brother kicks, and your grandmother mutters her evening prayers 2 inches from your ear. Still, it was practical. Body heat meant survival. Now, in richer households, things weren't much better, just fancier. Nobles and gentry had what we might call beds, but these were less about sleeping and more about showing off. A large, carved wooden bed frame with curtains for warmth and a canopy for a bit of privacy. But they also weren't necessarily sleeping alone either. Servants often shared the room, sleeping on benches or even at the foot of the bed. Guests were sometimes invited into the bed, because in medieval culture, sharing a bed didn't always mean what we think it means now. It was a gesture of trust, of intimacy, yes, but not necessarily sexual. You could share a bed with your lord, your guest, or your fellow traveler, and it was just normal. There are actual letters from the 15th century where noblemen casually mention, "I slept with the Duke last night." And they absolutely meant it in the most literal, non-romantic way possible. Of course, that didn't mean nothing ever happened. The medieval bed could be a site of deep theological reflection or questionable decision-making, depending on the night. Let's float over to a medieval monastery for a second, shall we? Monks, unlike peasants, had strict sleeping rules. They slept in long dormitories, usually on hard straw mattresses or wooden planks, fully dressed, ready to jump up for night prayers at any moment. Celibacy meant no sharing beds, of course, but monks still snored, coughed, and occasionally broke wind during the holy hours. Imagine trying to commune with God while your neighbor sounds like a congested donkey. In nunneries, things weren't much better. The rules said one thing, modesty, solitude, prayer, but reality often said another. Records from the 13th century show abbesses complaining that nuns were sneaking into each other's beds for warmth. Whether that warmth was emotional, spiritual, or otherwise, the chroniclers leave to our imagination. And so, in both peasants' huts and noble chambers, the medieval bed wasn't just furniture. It was a stage for the entire human experience. Birth, death, gossip, prayer, and yes, questionable hygiene. Because remember, changing the sheets wasn't the thing. The sheets were often just linen covers, washed infrequently, stuffed with straw that was replaced maybe twice a year. Imagine trying to sleep on a mattress that smelled like wet wool, smoke, and your cousin's feet. Sleep hygiene, medieval style. But perhaps the most charming or slightly unsettling part of this story is that many people didn't actually sleep through the night. Medieval people had what's called segmented sleep. They went to bed around sunset, slept for a few hours, then woke up in the middle of the night, around midnight, for a period called the watch. During the watch, people might pray, read, chat quietly, or even go outside to check on animals. Then, after an hour or two, they went back to bed for their second sleep. We actually have tons of historical references to first sleep and second sleep. It was totally normal. You might wake up, stretch, poke the fire, talk to your partner, even visit a neighbor. It was a quiet time, halfway between dream and day, and people thought of it as ideal for reflection. It's oddly poetic, isn't it? A society where midnight wasn't insomnia. It was just intermission. Now, let's drift back to the upper classes, where beds became more than just a place to rest. They became symbols. In medieval noble houses, beds were often the most expensive item of furniture, sometimes worth as much as a farm. They were portable, too. Nobles would travel with their beds, disassembling the frame and hauling it from castle to castle, like a personal comfort bubble. Henry VIII, for example, had a traveling bed made with gold-threaded fabric, complete with carved posts and velvet curtains, because apparently sleeping anywhere less than royal might offend his spine. Even marriages were witnessed in the bed, literally. The phrase wedding bed wasn't just metaphorical. Friends, family, and servants would escort the couple to bed on their wedding night, sometimes even staying in the room to ensure the marriage was, well, properly begun. Romantic? Not so much. Awkward? Absolutely. But it was part of the social order. The bed was where alliances were sealed, heirs conceived, and gossip born. And in many ways, it wasn't a private space at all. It was the most public piece of furniture you owned. Let's float again, this time to the 16th century, where sleeping positions start to shift, literally. If you've ever noticed how short medieval and Renaissance beds look in museums, you might have heard the theory that people were shorter back then. But that's not exactly true. Yes, some were a bit shorter, but not that much. The real reason beds were short was because people slept sitting up. Why? Well, partly for comfort. Those straw mattresses weren't exactly ergonomic, but also for superstition. People believed that lying flat resembled death, and it might invite death to take you early. So, many slept half reclined, propped up on bolsters, sometimes with multiple pillows behind them. And because they didn't have much concept of dental hygiene or fresh air circulation, they'd also wear nightcaps and close the bed curtains tight to keep out drafts and, unfortunately, to keep in every smell imaginable. So imagine it, a noble couple sitting upright in their curtained bed, surrounded by embroidered sheets, breathing each other's medieval morning breath until dawn. Romance? Thy name is mildew. The bed, in short, wasn't just a private piece of furniture. It was a mirror of the age itself. Communal, practical, superstitious, and, at times, deeply weird. It told you who you were, where you belonged, and how much you could afford to separate yourself from everyone else. And, as we drift further through this story, we'll see how the bed slowly transformed from a shared survival tool to a solitary luxury, from the smoky hut to the silken chamber, from straw and lice to Egyptian cotton. Let's float over to the Renaissance next, where beds finally started to resemble the ones we know today, and where sleep became just a bit more personal and a lot more performative. Renaissance bedrooms and the birth of privacy. Hey guys, welcome back to our very slow drift through the long, drowsy history of human sleeping habits. If you're still awake, congratulations! You've made it through the straw, the snores, and the snuggly nightmares of medieval communal beds. Now we're floating gently forward in time. It's the Renaissance, the 15th to 16th century, and the world is getting a little more polished, a little more perfumed, and a little more obsessed with being seen as elegant, even while sleeping. Because yes, this was the era when the act of going to bed became performance art. Let's start in Italy, naturally. If you are a wealthy Florentine merchant or noble, your bed wasn't just for sleeping, it was your throne of domestic majesty. The bed was often the most expensive item in the entire house, carved from walnut or oak, draped with embroidered silks, and raised high enough off the ground that you practically needed a small step stool to climb in. These beds had massive canopies, elaborate curtains, and ornate headboards covered in tapestries. The curtains weren't just decorative, they served a practical purpose too. They kept warmth in, light out, and gossip in the air where it belonged. Because by now, something curious was happening. The idea of privacy was being born. People were beginning to divide their homes into different rooms with actual doors. Imagine that. There were chambers for sleeping, for receiving guests, for dressing, and for praying. It was a slow cultural shift from the all-in-one room chaos of medieval life to a more structured domestic layout. Still, the line between public and private wasn't entirely clear. In many noble homes, your bedroom was still a semi-public space. Visitors might be invited right up to your bedside to talk politics or do business while you reclined among your pillows. And yes, you'd often do this in your fancy nightclothes, because being seen at rest was another way of showing status. Your nightshirt might be made of fine linen, your bedrobe embroidered velvet, and of course, the bed itself was draped in gold-threaded curtains, because heaven forbid anyone think you slept like a normal person. Let's glide northward now, into France. The French court practically turned the bed into a stage set. Take King Louis XIV, for example. Yes, the Sun King himself. He turned waking up and going to bed into public ceremonies. Every morning, he performed the lever, the rising, and every night, the coucher. Courtiers were invited to attend both, standing reverently as the king was dressed or undressed by his attendants. It was all part of reinforcing royal power. Even his bedtime was a public act of state. Now, this might sound bizarre, but to the French nobility, being invited to watch the king get into bed was an honor. Imagine being proud to say, yes, I was there when His Majesty tucked in. Peak career achievement. Louis's bedchamber at Versailles wasn't tucked away in some quiet wing. It was at the very center of the palace. The architecture itself radiated outward from his bed, symbolizing how all life, power, and privilege flowed from him. He was, after all, the Sun King. And the bed? That was the solar core. Of course, Louis wasn't the first to blur the line between bedroom and throne room. French and Burgundian nobles before him had been hosting bed audiences for centuries, lying elegantly on their pillows while receiving visitors, issuing commands, or accepting petitions. It wasn't about laziness. It was about presentation. The bed became a kind of social throne, so much so that when you lay in state after death, your body was displayed on your actual bed. The symbolism came full circle. Now, while kings were hosting slumber parties with political overtones, ordinary people were still sleeping quite differently. Commoners in Renaissance Europe often had simple wooden frames with ropes strung across to hold up a mattress stuffed with straw, feathers, or a mix of both.
Those ropes had to be tightened periodically, hence the old phrase, sleep tight. And because mattresses were filled with whatever you could find, wool, hay, even dried corn husks, they weren't exactly odor neutral. If you think your current mattress needs flipping, imagine sleeping on something that occasionally sprouted insects. Pillows were also a luxury. Most peasants had only one for the whole family. Sometimes the pillow was just a folded tunic. And sheets? Those were rare for the poor. Linen was expensive, and you might wash it a few times a year, maybe. So if you lived below the noble line, your bed was still a communal, utilitarian thing. But if you were rich, your bed was practically a celebrity. Let's drift into the boudoirs of the noble women. For aristocratic ladies, the bedchamber became a private yet performative space, a place where beauty, ritual, and gossip intertwined. Morning routines were a social event. Ladies would rise late, because rising early was for peasants, and spend their mornings being attended by maids, hairdressers, and sometimes priests, all within the curtained sanctum of the bed. Visitors would be admitted to the outer chamber to wait while the lady prepared herself for the day. The inner chamber, the actual bed, was off limits except for her closest confidants. This double-chamber design was new to Europe and symbolized a growing awareness of personal space. It was a soft birth of the modern concept of privacy. And yet, it was still all about being seen. A lady's bed was often visible through open curtains, with tapestries depicting mythological scenes, Venus, Cupid, or other slightly scandalous figures, just subtle enough to be respectable, but suggestive enough to be interesting. Because yes, while we often imagine the Renaissance as all art and intellect, people were still, well, people. The bed remained the stage for flirtation, marriage, and politics, all under embroidered canopies.
Now, let's take a quiet stroll through the evolution of sleeping position. As we mentioned earlier, medieval folks liked to sleep sitting up. But by the Renaissance, that started to change. Physicians, ever confident in their questionable theories, began recommending reclining positions for better digestion and circulation of the humors. We also see the first mention of people sleeping side by side as couples, rather than in upright solitude. Romantic, in theory, less so in practice, given hygiene standards. Perfume was often used to disguise the general musk of nightly life. You'd also find small bed accessories that feel oddly modern. Night tables or bed stools appeared, precursors to our nightstands, where people placed candles, religious icons, or cups of spiced wine. That's right, medieval and Renaissance sleepers liked a little drink before bed, too. Warm wine or ale was believed to calm the body and balance the humors. So in a sense, your late-night glass of wine has a long and noble pedigree. Let's move across Europe to Tudor England. By the 1500s, English beds had become masterpieces of carpentry, heavily carved, massive, and built to outlive the owners. The Great Bed of Ware, for example, was a famous inn bed, so large it could comfortably fit more than a dozen people. It became a tourist attraction because, of course, nothing says luxury like being able to host a small crowd while you nap. But ordinary Tudor homes, much simpler. In small cottages, a wooden frame might hold a mattress filled with straw, called a palliasse. The children often slept on trundle beds that slid under the main one. So while noble beds grew more elaborate, the commoners remained practical, if slightly itchy. Interestingly, this period also saw the rise of personal bedding. People began owning their own sheets and pillows rather than sharing everything communally. This subtle shift marked another step toward individuality. The bed was slowly becoming yours, not everyone's. Let's pause here for a moment. Imagine drifting off in a Renaissance chamber. The fire's low. Candles flicker on the carved posts. The air smells faintly of beeswax and wool. Outside, maybe the city bells toll for curfew. You're lying under layers of linen and fur, the curtains drawn around your bed like a small private universe. You're not entirely alone,
Your maid might be nearby, dozing by the hearth, but for the first time in centuries, you have a sense of personal stillness. It's quiet. It's warm. It's almost modern. But not quite. Because even though people were starting to sleep in private rooms, the idea of sleep itself was still deeply moralized. Doctors and preachers warned against oversleeping. It was sloth. Sleeping naked was discouraged. It tempted the devil, apparently. And dreams? Dreams were a whole moral battlefield of their own. A good dream might be divine inspiration. A bad dream might mean demonic interference or indigestion, which, given the Renaissance diet, was probably both. So as we move forward from here, things are about to get even cozier and a bit more scientific. The 17th and 18th centuries will bring us closer to the kind of sleep we recognize today, with soft pillows, feather mattresses, and the luxury of sleeping alone, if you could afford it. So let's gently roll over into part 4. From feathers to fashion, how the bed became a status symbol.
From feathers to fashion, how the bed became a status symbol. Hey again, night wanderers. If you're still here, you're either very interested in beds or very committed to falling asleep to a calm, meandering voice that refuses to get to the point quickly. Either way, perfect. We've drifted through the medieval hay piles, tiptoed around Renaissance luxury, and now we're gliding softly into the 17th and 18th centuries, the age of powdered wigs, candlelight, and decorative everything. This was when beds stopped being just places to sleep and officially became fashion statements. Let's start with France again, because of course we are. Louis XIV, whom we left earlier hosting royal bed ceremonies, was followed by Louis XV and Louis XVI, who took bedroom decor to new levels of self-indulgent artistry. At Versailles, each royal bedroom was like a museum exhibit of fabric. Walls were draped in silk damask, the ceilings gilded, and the beds themselves floated on carved frames of gold and ivory. These weren't cozy spaces, they were theatrical. Every fold of cloth had meaning. Every tassel was a declaration of taste, money, and inherited importance. And here's the thing, these luxurious beds were often tiny. You'd think a king would have a king-sized bed, but in reality, many royal beds were surprisingly narrow, barely enough space for one very important sleeper. That's because sleep itself wasn't the goal of the royal bedchamber. It was the ritual surrounding it. Sleeping was the least interesting part of owning the bed. Let's slide the curtains aside and peek into an 18th century Parisian boudoir. Here, the bed was no longer a public stage for politics. It was a private stage for flirtation. The French word boudoir literally means sulking room, but in practice, it was where elite women received their closest friends or lovers. The decor was lush, pastel silks, curved furniture, faint perfume, and soft candlelight bouncing off mirrors. The bed sat at the center, low to the ground, its canopy now transformed into graceful drapery instead of fortress curtains. It was all about comfort that looked effortless. This was also the golden age of the feather bed. If you had money, you slept on layer after layer of goose down, topped with embroidered linen sheets. A good feather mattress could cost as much as a servant's yearly wage. So yes, every night you literally slept on your social class. And while kings were sleeping in brocade, commoners were slowly improving their own setups too. By the 1700s, even modest homes might have wooden bedsteads with rope supports and tick mattresses filled with feathers or wool. No more straw heaps on the floor. Progress smelled faintly of geese and lavender soap. Now, something fascinating started happening in this period. Sleep began to separate itself into distinct private zones. For centuries, sleeping together had been normal. Whole families, even guests, all in one space. But now, as houses got bigger and families wealthier, people started sleeping in their own rooms. This wasn't just about comfort, it was moral too. The Enlightenment, that grand intellectual movement of reason and order, extended even to bedtime. Personal privacy was suddenly seen as civilized. Individual sleep was rational. In short, if you could afford to sleep alone, you probably bragged about it. Bedrooms were also gendered now. Ladies had chambers or boudoirs, gentlemen had studies or dressing rooms, and each was decorated according to personality, or at least the personality you wanted others to believe you had. The bedroom was becoming psychological territory. Let's wander, half dreaming, into England during the Georgian period. Here, furniture design reached an almost obsessive level of craftsmanship. Beds had cabriole legs, carved crests, and mosquito nets that looked like lace sculptures. And the fabrics, chintz, calico, damask, changed with the seasons. Summer might see airy cotton, while winter meant layers of heavy wool and velvet. Sleep had turned into theatrical domestic art. But something else was happening too. Hygiene was finally getting attention. The 18th century saw the idea that air should be fresh. Windows were opened, bed linens were washed more frequently, sometimes even weekly if you were truly radical. Mattresses were beaten and aired out in the sun to chase away dust mites, though of course no one knew what those were yet. For the first time, there was a link between cleanliness and healthful sleep. Meanwhile, science was also creeping into the conversation. Doctors began writing pamphlets about the proper sleeping posture, the correct number of hours, and even the ideal direction for your bed to face. Some swore that sleeping north to south improved circulation. Others insisted on facing east so you could rise with the sun, though that's only useful if your curtains weren't embroidered with 20 pounds of velvet. There were endless debates about whether to sleep on your back, side, or stomach. One 18th century physician wrote passionately that sleeping on your left side could lead to corruption of the humors. He didn't explain how, but people nodded wisely and carried on anyway. It's always comforting to know that medical advice has been consistently confusing for at least 400 years.
Now, before we drift further, let's talk about one of the strangest quirks of early modern sleep, the two sleeps phenomenon. In pre-industrial Europe, people didn't usually sleep straight through the night. They had a first sleep and a second sleep. The first lasted a few hours after dusk. Then people would wake up, light a candle, pray, chat, have a snack, or visit a neighbor, before lying down again for the second sleep until dawn. This middle-of-the-night wakeful period was normal, peaceful even. It wasn't insomnia, it was just how human circadian rhythms worked before artificial lighting. You might get up and tend to small chores, read, or just think quietly. It was considered an ideal time for reflection, or for a discreet romantic visit, depending on your priorities. When industrialization came and clocks began dictating schedules, the two sleep patterns slowly faded. But even today, if you find yourself waking up at 3 a.m., congratulations, you're just being historically authentic. Let's peek back into the royal chambers before the candles burn out. At Versailles, the etiquette surrounding beds had reached almost ridiculous heights. There were rules about who could hand the king his nightshirt, rules about which noble could close the bed curtains, rules about who could speak before the king fell asleep. Everything was symbolic, ritualized, and drenched in politics. The bed was no longer just a piece of furniture. It was a throne of velvet diplomacy. Even dreams, if you were royal, might have been considered state secrets. And yet, in all that opulence, the basic human act of sleep remained exactly the same. Whether on straw or silk, people still dreamed, tossed, snored, and occasionally fell out of bed. Outside the palaces, though, the world was quietly changing. By the late 18th century, factories hummed, cities grew, and people's schedules became dictated by the clock instead of the sun. Sleep, once flexible and spiritual, was becoming efficient. Night was for rest, day was for labor. And the bedroom became a smaller, quieter space, a retreat from the industrial noise of life. The curtains got thinner, the beds wider, the privacy deeper. If you're still with me, still gently drifting between curiosity and drowsiness, perfect. Because the next stretch of our sleepy history is about to enter the modern era. Soft pillows, iron bed frames, and finally, the idea of the individual sleeper. So let's pull the blanket up a little higher and drift softly into Part 5, Victorian Nights, the Age of Sleep, Science, and Secrets.
Victorian Nights, the Age of Sleep, Science, and Secrets. Hey there, still awake? Or maybe half asleep, which honestly is the ideal state for this story, because we're floating gently into the Victorian era now, a time when sleep, modesty, and repressed emotion shared a very crowded bed. If you're picturing lace curtains, oil lamps, and stern portraits watching you from the wall, you're already there. Let's start with the basics. The Victorian bedroom was the birthplace of what we now consider proper sleep. Before this, beds were communal, social, sometimes political. But by the mid-19th century, the bedroom had become private, intimate, almost sacred in its domesticity. A Victorian bedroom wasn't just where you slept. It was where morality itself was supposed to happen. The space was orderly, modest, and stuffed with rules. No bare wood, no visible ankles on furniture. Yes, even tables had skirts. Every item, pillows, curtains, slippers, was designed to whisper, "This is a respectable home." The Victorian bed itself was a marvel of craftsmanship and symbolism. Gone were the hay and ropes of medieval times. Now you had cast-iron bed frames, brass finials gleaming in gaslight, and mattresses stuffed with horsehair or koi fiber. They were heavy, ornate, and built to last through generations, or at least a few serious illnesses. Because here's the uncomfortable truth. People spent a lot of time in bed back then, often for reasons other than sleep. Victorian medicine loved a good rest cure. If you were stressed, anxious, or female, which apparently counted as a medical condition at the time, you might be prescribed weeks or months of bed rest. So beds became both furniture and therapy, a space for sleep and for slow, elegant suffering. Now let's dim the light a little and talk about something Victorians rarely admitted aloud: sex and sleep. For a culture obsessed with morality, the Victorians were also quietly obsessed with what went on under the covers. Medical journals of the time are full of warnings about excessive stimulation, nocturnal emissions, and other sleep-adjacent horrors that sound like the plot of a very strange ghost story. There were pamphlets claiming that separate beds could prevent moral decay, and advice columns insisting that husbands and wives should sleep apart for reasons of hygiene and virtue. It wasn't uncommon for married couples to have two single beds in the same room, or even in different rooms altogether. Queen Victoria herself slept separately from Prince Albert after their early years, though they were apparently quite fond of nightly visits. So yes, the Victorian bed was both a monument to purity and a very busy piece of furniture. But here's something more endearing. Victorians also romanticized sleep itself. They saw it as a moral act, a divine rest granted by God.
There were poems, paintings, and essays celebrating the purity of slumber. A sleeping woman became a symbol of innocence, a sleeping child of heaven itself. And if you think that sounds wholesome, remember, this was also the same culture that loved photographing dead people as if they were sleeping. Yes, the Victorians practiced post-mortem photography, often arranging the deceased in peaceful poses on their beds, eyes closed, sometimes surrounded by flowers or siblings who looked not entirely convinced. It was their way of merging death and sleep, the eternal rest. Creepy? A bit, but oddly poetic in that very Victorian way. Meanwhile, the Industrial Revolution was changing the rhythm of night entirely. Gas lamps and later electricity pushed bedtime later and later. For the first time, humans could choose not to sleep when it got dark. Cities glowed through the night, people worked in shifts, partied longer, and slept shorter. And the Victorians, being very proud of their progress, also immediately started worrying about it. Doctors wrote essays warning that artificial light was corrupting the body's natural rhythm. Moralists complained that staying up past midnight was a sin against nature. And newspapers debated whether modern civilization was literally making people tired. Spoiler, it was. Let's drift into one of those middle-class London homes. It's around 1880. You'd find thick curtains drawn against the city's smoky glow, a fire crackling quietly in the grate. The bed, high and heavy, covered in layers of quilts and counterpanes. Beside it, a small nightstand holding a candle, a Bible, and maybe a glass of water with a spoon resting in it. On the chair, a neatly folded nightgown, always cotton or linen, always modest. The atmosphere? Calm, controlled, respectable to the point of suffocation.
But beyond those lace curtains, something was shifting. The late 19th century began to bring science into the bedroom, not scandal, but literal sleep science. Doctors started studying dreams. Psychologists began theorizing about the subconscious. And then, of course, came Sigmund Freud, who turned nighttime thoughts into daytime conversations no one really wanted to have. Before Freud, dreams were divine messages or nonsense. After Freud, they became windows to your deepest secrets, and people suddenly felt very self-conscious about falling asleep. So the Victorian bed was no longer just for rest, it was a laboratory of the mind. Sleep habits were evolving too. As factories set strict working hours, the 8-hour sleep schedule became the new ideal. 8 hours for work, 8 for rest, and 8 for what we will. That neat division of life, so clean, so balanced, was a product of industrial efficiency. It turned humans into predictable, clockwork sleepers. Gone were the two medieval sleeps, the leisurely dawn chats, the soft half-dreams by candlelight. Sleep had been industrialized. Even rest, by the end of the 19th century, had a schedule. And yet, amid all the order and discipline, the Victorians couldn't help but infuse sleep with emotion. They wrote letters to loved ones describing their dreams. They kept diaries of sleepless nights and haunting thoughts. They even designed mourning beds for the recently deceased, because why not make grief fashionable too? One particularly wealthy widow in Bath ordered a bed with black silk curtains embroidered with silver stars. She slept there every night for 30 years after her husband's death, claiming it made her feel close to the other world. That's the Victorian spirit. Half rational, half haunted, and beautifully tragic about both. By the turn of the century, sleep had become modern. We had standardized bedtime, standardized sheets, standardized everything. But deep down, something ancient remained. The human need for comfort, warmth, and a safe little corner to escape the noise of the world. Because whether you're a peasant in straw or a queen in silk, that moment of lying down, closing your eyes, and surrendering to the dark, it's the one truly democratic ritual. Everyone does it. Everyone dreams. And so, as our long, sleepy drift through history continues, we'll gently glide into the 20th century next, where the invention of electricity, mattresses with springs, and even the rise of the alarm clock will change not just how we sleep, but how we wake up. Let's roll over softly into Part 6, the modern bed, electricity, advertising, and the death of the nap.
The modern bed, electricity, advertising, and the death of the nap. Hey there, you're still awake. Impressive. Or maybe you've drifted in and out, catching a word here, a dream there. That's fine too. Tonight's story is about modernity, the thing that ruins sleep for all of us. Because once humans got their hands on electric light, bedtime stopped being something that happened to us and became something we had to schedule. Let's ease into it. Picture the early 1900s. Cities glowing with electric bulbs, streetlights humming softly, factories running through the night. For the first time, darkness wasn't in charge anymore. Humans were. It sounds empowering, right? Except, of course, it meant nobody really knew when to stop. Before electricity, night had a rhythm. Candles burned down, oil lamps sputtered out, and even the most determined gossip eventually had to go to bed. But now, you could stay up reading, sewing, pacing, working, whatever your anxiety required. By the 1920s, urban people were sleeping nearly 2 hours less than their pre-industrial ancestors. And no one seemed to care, because being tired became a kind of social badge. If you were exhausted, it meant you were productive, important, modern. Sleep was starting to look lazy. And then came advertising, the silent dream killer. Companies realized there was money in sleep, or rather, in fixing it. Mattress companies began producing lush, glossy ads promising scientific comfort. You'd see elegant couples lounging in perfectly white beds, smiling as if they had just invented rest. Spring mattresses appeared, filled with coils and promises of support, a word that somehow made sleep sound like a business plan. Then came the alarm clock industry, because why gently wake up to sunlight when you could jolt yourself awake with a mechanical panic attack at 6 a.m.? By the mid-20th century, alarm clocks were everywhere. The morning rush was institutionalized. We'd successfully turned sleep into another thing to manage, measure, and interrupt. Meanwhile, something quietly tragic happened. The nap died. For thousands of years, humans had slept in segments, 2 sleeps at night or a nap during the day, but the industrial workday made that impossible. Factories didn't pause for siestas, office clerks didn't snooze between ledgers, and by the time we got home, we were too tired to do anything except stare at the radio, then the television, and eventually the glowing rectangle of doom we call a smartphone. The result? Humans now sleep less, worse, and with more guilt than any of our ancestors. Let's linger in a 1950s bedroom for a moment. Everything is neat, pastel, and geometrically polite. Twin beds, yes, those still existed, often sat side by side for married couples, because TV culture still pretended sex didn't exist. There's a floral lamp on each nightstand, a ticking alarm clock, and maybe a Reader's Digest or two stacked neatly beside it. Beds were no longer ornate thrones of wood and drapery. They were practical, modern, efficient. Even rest had to look tidy. And yet, behind those prim smiles and the advertisements, insomnia was quietly becoming a national epidemic. Doctors began writing about nervous exhaustion and psychological wakefulness. Sleep pills appeared, and once they did, they never went away.
Let's not skip the 1960s, though. the age of rebellion, free love, and beanbags. Suddenly, beds became political again. People posed in them for magazine covers, used them for protests, John Lennon and Yoko Ono's famous bed-ins, and wrote songs about staying in bed forever. It was a short-lived revolution, though. By the 1980s, the rise and grind mentality had taken over. Sleep was once again the enemy of ambition. Sleep is for the weak, said every over-caffeinated entrepreneur ever since. Meanwhile, doctors kept politely reminding everyone that chronic sleep deprivation was slowly turning society into zombies with health insurance. But the modern bed did evolve. Memory foam, adjustable frames, sleep systems. It all sounds futuristic, doesn't it? Yet, under all that marketing, it's still the same story. A human body trying to rest while the world outside refuses to slow down. And the irony? We've never talked more about sleep. We have podcasts about it, apps to track it, watches that buzz at us when we don't get enough of it. We analyze our dreams with algorithms and pay subscription fees for digital lullabies. It's as if we've forgotten how to do the one thing every cave-dwelling ancestor did perfectly well without Wi-Fi. Now, let's dim the LED glow and get a little sentimental. Because beneath all the gadgets, schedules, and science, sleep remains stubbornly mysterious. We still don't fully understand why we dream or what exactly the brain is doing while we're out cold. And despite all the mattresses and melatonin gummies, many of us still wake up at 3 a.m. for no reason other than being human. There's something oddly comforting about that. The shared, ancient insomnia of it all. Your body doesn't care about time zones or stock markets. It still wants what it's always wanted: warmth, darkness, and the quiet heartbeat of another human being somewhere nearby. If you listen closely tonight, you can almost hear the echo of 1,000 beds creaking through history. The straw pallets, the rope frames, the royal canopies, the factory bunks, the suburban twin sets, all part of the same long, sleepy story. We've gone from huddling in medieval halls to isolating ourselves in minimalist apartments. We've replaced whispers and candlelight with scrolling and blue light. But the desire is unchanged. To close your eyes, to surrender the weight of consciousness, to trust that in the dark you'll be safe until morning. So here's your lullaby whispered through time. Every empire falls, every revolution fades, every mattress sags eventually. But sleep, sweet, stubborn, dream-soaked sleep, endures. And that, dear listener, is the true history of the bed. The future of sleep, digital dreams, space beds, and the end of night. Hey again, still here? Good. That means you're either really into beds, or you've fallen asleep and your device is quietly draining its battery beside you. Either way, let's drift one more time, this time into the future. Because if history tells us how humans used to sleep, the future is quietly asking, what happens when we stop needing to? Let's start with space, because of course we will. When astronauts go to the International Space Station, they take sleep with them. But it's weird up there. No gravity, no up or down, no night or day. The sun rises and sets every 90 minutes. So, astronauts strap themselves into small sleeping bags that are attached to the wall, floating like vertical burritos. They close their eyes and hope their brains stop screaming about the missing gravity. NASA discovered that in microgravity, sleep becomes fragmented. People wake up more, dream less, and often end up sleep-deprived even though they technically rested. In other words, humanity invented space travel but still can't get a good night's sleep, which, frankly, feels on brand. But back down on Earth, things are getting just as strange. Let's talk about AI sleep monitoring. You might have noticed your phone or smartwatch quietly tracking you at night, recording your heart rate, your oxygen levels, your little tosses and turns. It sends you cheerful reports every morning, like, "Good morning.
You were restless between 2:13 and 2:47 a.m., possibly due to existential dread. We're training machines to interpret the very thing we don't fully understand ourselves. And of course, it's all marketed as optimization, because in the 21st century, even rest must be productive. We're no longer sleeping, we're recovering, resetting, maximizing REM efficiency. The bed has become a laboratory, and we are the very relaxed guinea pigs. Now, let's float into something more speculative. Dream hacking. Neuroscientists are quietly working on ways to influence dreams in real time. Experiments have shown that mild electrical stimulation or gentle sound cues can nudge dream content. Imagine this. You put on a sleek headband at night. It monitors your brainwaves, and when you enter REM sleep, it starts to play subtle prompts. A voice, a sound, a word, guiding your dreams. Advertisers are already interested, because why sell to you when awake if they could rent out your subconscious between 2 and 4 a.m.? It's not as far-fetched as it sounds. In 2021, researchers literally tested dream incubation with branded prompts. So, if one day you dream of sipping a soda you don't even like, you'll know capitalism has reached REM. Let's step back from the nightmare of marketing for a moment, because something gentler is also happening. There's a quiet movement trying to reclaim sleep, to make it sacred again. Digital detox retreats, sleep coaches, meditation apps that sound suspiciously like monks with Bluetooth microphones. It's all an attempt to remember that sleep isn't a weakness. It's an act of rebellion in a world that never stops. Even the architecture of bedrooms is changing. Designers are experimenting with dark rooms, soundproof, screen-free, with temperature and light control that mimics medieval simplicity. Essentially, we're reinventing the monastery, but with memory foam and mood lighting.
Now, imagine the post-human bed. You climb into what looks like a sleek capsule. It scans your body, senses your temperature, adjusts automatically. It might even play gentle vibrations to help you drift off. Your AI assistant whispers, "Good night. You've scheduled 8 hours of sleep. I'll monitor dreams for anxiety patterns and suggest therapy notes in the morning." You're half creeped out, half impressed. And then you fall asleep anyway. Because no matter how futuristic it gets, your brain still wants what every caveman wanted: a safe space to shut down for a while. And what happens after that? Well, some scientists think humans might eventually edit out sleep altogether. They're studying genetic mutations in people who need only 4 hours of sleep without side effects. They're testing drugs that could replace a full night's rest with a 2-hour neurochemical recharge. It sounds like progress, until you remember that the only time humans stop producing chaos is when we're unconscious. A sleepless world would be endlessly productive and endlessly unbearable. So maybe we shouldn't rush to cure sleep. Maybe, just maybe, the reason it still exists after millions of years is because we need that pause, the temporary escape from ourselves. Let's take one last float through time. From the hay mattresses of medieval peasants to the golden canopy beds of kings, from the shared hearths of families to the lonely glow of digital bedrooms, sleep has always been the one thing that equalizes us. It erases class, ambition, ego. No matter who you are, you drool the same in your sleep. And maybe that's the real secret behind the strange history of beds. They're not monuments to comfort, they're monuments to surrender. Every night, we lay down our weapons, our worries, our identities, and simply power off. And when we wake, if we're lucky, we get to rebuild ourselves again. So, if you're still awake, congratulations. You've just listened to roughly 2,000 years of bedtime evolution. But if you're asleep by now, perfect. That's exactly how this was supposed to end. Good night, dear listener. May your bed be long enough, your pillow not too flat, and your dreams utterly unproductive.
A final rest, death, tomb beds, and the last sleep of kings. Hey there, welcome back, or maybe welcome still. If you're somehow still awake, you deserve a medieval medal, or at least a pillow that isn't stuffed with straw. Because tonight, we're floating into one last, oddly poetic chapter of the story of sleep. This time, we're not talking about rest between days. We're talking about the final rest. The one with no morning bells, no matins, and no chance of being late for work.
That's right.
Death. The ultimate nap. And in the Middle Ages, they really leaned into that metaphor. Let's start with a little irony. The same society that thought sleep was a tiny rehearsal for death also treated death like a particularly fancy bedtime. If you've ever wandered through a medieval cathedral, you've seen those tomb effigies, stone figures lying serenely atop their slabs, hands folded in prayer, faces calm. They look asleep, because that's the point. The Latin term for burial sites, dormitorium, literally means place of sleeping. That's where monks and nuns were buried, in the dormitory courtyard, symbolically resting until Judgment Day. So, yes, even in death, medieval people couldn't escape the bedtime theme. Now let's glide into something a bit macabre, but quietly lovely. The bed of death. In noble households, the deathbed was a literal stage. When someone important was dying, the room filled with priests, family, servants, maybe a scribe taking notes for the final will. Curtains were drawn, candles flickered, and the dying person would often lie in an elaborately carved bed, often the same one they were conceived in. A poetic full circle. Or a logistical nightmare for the mattress cleaner. This was called the ars moriendi, the art of dying well. Because even in dying, there were rules, rituals, and choreography. You had to face east toward Jerusalem. You had to confess. You had to forgive your enemies, or at least pretend to, while quietly hoping they'd stub a toe on their way out. When it was done, they'd lay the body out in that same bed, dressed in their best robe, surrounded by candles and relics. Sometimes a priest sprinkled holy water over the sheets, because even linen needed a blessing after years of medieval hygiene. And here's where things get quietly surreal. When kings died, their beds became relics. Take King Henry VII of England. His deathbed was preserved, almost like a throne. And Louis XIV, the Sun King, literally ruled from his bed. He gave royal audiences in it, held council meetings, and occasionally, well, not state business. His lever and coucher, his waking and sleeping ceremonies, were political theater. Hundreds of courtiers attended every night just to watch him get tucked in. Because apparently, absolute power means never having a private nap again. When he finally died in that same bed, after ruling for 72 years, the attendants probably didn't even notice right away. They'd seen him sleep through half his government meetings anyway. Let's drift away from royalty for a moment, to the simpler graves of peasants. Most people couldn't afford tomb effigies, of course, but they still used the same imagery. Burial shrouds were sometimes embroidered with stars and angels, like a heavenly quilt. Children were buried with toys, and bodies were laid flat, as if sleeping. Some graves even show faint outlines of pillows carved into the stone. Little reminders that, in the medieval imagination, heaven was not so much a golden city as a place where you could finally rest. After all, life back then was exhausting. Work, famine, disease, confession, repeat.
Eternal rest probably sounded like a luxury spa package. But even in that, there was unease. Because if sleep was a metaphor for death, then dreams were the dangerous in-between. Medieval theologians worried that dreams were the devil's playground. Some said demons whispered in your ear while you slept, planting temptation. Others believed dreams could foretell your fate, your death date, your sins, or your salvation. So people prayed before bed not just for rest, but for protection from their own dreams. The bedtime prayer, "Now I lay me down to sleep, I pray the Lord my soul to keep," that's a direct descendant of those medieval fears. Because if you didn't wake up, well, you'd already said goodbye. Let's float, gently, to one last figure, the sleeping Virgin Mary. In medieval art, her death wasn't called a death at all. It was called the dormition, meaning the falling asleep. She's often shown lying peacefully on a golden bed, surrounded by angels, like the ultimate bedtime story ending. That image comforted believers. It told them death wasn't terror, it was transition, a quiet drift from one kind of rest to another. And maybe that's the whole secret behind humanity's obsession with beds. We build them not just for sleep, but for practice. Every night we surrender control. We stop thinking, stop moving, stop existing for a few hours, and somehow trust that we'll return. It's rehearsal for the inevitable. And maybe that's why we've spent millennia trying to make it beautiful. So tonight, as you lie there listening, whether in a grand bed or a creaky one, on silk sheets or a mattress older than your last phone, remember, you're part of a story that started thousands of years ago. Every sigh, every blanket tug, every dream, it's part of humanity's oldest ritual: to sleep, to rest, to surrender, and for now, to wake again. Next time, maybe we'll drift somewhere even quieter. Maybe into dreams themselves.
Hey, you're still here. That's kind of comforting. Or mildly concerning, depending on how long you've been awake. Either way, welcome back to our slow descent into the strange subconscious of the Middle Ages. We've wandered through beds, through prayers, through death itself. So now, naturally, we drift into the world between sleep and waking. Dreams. Or, as medieval people might have called them, divine messages, demonic traps, or occasionally just bad digestion. Because yes, if you woke up in 13th century France after dreaming of a talking fish, there was about a 50-50 chance someone would tell you it was either God or your stomach sending you a message. Dreams, in the medieval imagination, were complicated. They were never just brain static. They were cosmic post-it notes. And depending on who you asked, they came from heaven, hell, or the suspicious meat pie you ate before bed. Let's start with St. Augustine, who basically laid the groundwork for the medieval psychology of dreams. He said dreams could be divine, God whispering wisdom into your ear while your guard was down. But, he added, they could also be dangerous, because the devil, ever the opportunist, loved to slide into your subconscious like an unwanted guest at a dinner party. So if you dreamed of sin, it didn't necessarily mean you had sinned. It might just mean you were spiritually being catfished. Now, monks and nuns had entire systems for interpreting their dreams, and of course, they wrote about them in excruciating detail. Imagine waking up, bleary-eyed from chanting at 2 a.m., and having to explain to your confessor that you dreamed of kissing someone. And no, it wasn't St. Peter.
Some abbesses kept dream journals. They believed certain dreams were warnings, omens of plague, famine, or the next round of church politics. Others saw them as messages from saints. If you dreamed of Mary, for instance, that was considered a blessing. If you dreamed of a goat, well, time to book an exorcism. But let's not pretend it was all holy visions and symbolic roses. The Middle Ages had nightmares, deep, suffocating, heavy-chested ones. And people didn't think they came from stress. They thought something was sitting on them. Enter the Mara, or night hag. In Northern Europe, people believed a demon, or sometimes a witch, literally sat on your chest while you slept, crushing the breath out of you. That's where we get the word nightmare, not from bad dream, but from night Mara, the being that rode you through your sleep. So when a medieval person woke up sweating, heart racing, and gasping for air, they didn't call it sleep paralysis. They blamed the hag, or an incubus, or their ex. And then there were the dream prophecies. Kings and queens naturally took their dreams very seriously, because if you were ruling by divine right, every weird subconscious flicker might be a memo from God. Take Charlemagne, for example. According to chroniclers, he once dreamed that his spear burst into flames. A priest interpreted it as a warning that his empire would soon be consumed by chaos, which, to be fair, it kind of was. Or William the Conqueror, who allegedly dreamed of building a tower so tall that he could see heaven, and promptly built castles across England just to make sure the symbolism stuck. There's even a story about Henry II, who dreamed of his dead friend Thomas Becket appearing to him, bleeding but calm. The dream, of course, came after Henry had ordered Becket's murder. Convenient timing, really. But not all dreamers were kings or saints. Ordinary people dreamed too. About harvests, lost lovers, stolen bread. And they wanted meaning. So naturally, a medieval version of dream dictionaries appeared. Manuscripts listing hundreds of possible dream symbols and their interpretations. Dreamed of bees? That's good fortune. Dreamed of shoes? A journey. Dreamed of teeth falling out? Someone close to you will die. Yes, that one's been haunting us for centuries. Some manuscripts were so popular that monks copied them over and over, even though the church technically disapproved of dream interpretation. But then again, the church disapproved of nearly everything, so that wasn't saying much.
Of course, it wasn't all mystical insight. Sometimes people just dreamed weird stuff. There's one record from a 14th century monk who dreamed of talking bread loaves, warning him not to overeat. Another nun claimed she dreamed of being chased by a goose carrying a candle, which, according to her confessor, symbolized vanity. Though, honestly, it just sounds like she fell asleep hungry and slightly afraid of poultry. Dreams could even be used as evidence in trials or disputes. If a nun claimed Saint Catherine appeared in her dream and told her the abbess was corrupt, that counted as testimony. So yes, medieval Europe was a place where you could lose your job because someone dreamed badly about you. Now, let's drift back to those night hags for a second, because in art and folklore, they became oddly sensual figures. Dark, shapeless women slipping through locked doors, sitting on the chests of men, whispering temptations. Half demon, half fantasy. The church hated that idea, of course, but they also couldn't quite erase it. So for centuries, European men blamed their sinful dreams, not on desire, but on demons. It was the ultimate medieval version of, it's not me, it's you. One monk even wrote that he was visited nightly by a beautiful spirit who tested his faith. Translation, he was having erotic dreams and feeling very guilty about it.
Dreams, in short, were never private. They were examined, discussed, interpreted, sometimes even punished. If you dreamed too vividly, you might be accused of pride. If you dreamed too darkly, of heresy. And if you dreamed of freedom, well, good luck explaining that to the Inquisition. So, medieval sleep wasn't restful. It was another form of surveillance, by God, by conscience, and sometimes by your confessor. But still, amid all that fear, dreams offered escape. A way out of the stone walls, the long prayers, the cold mornings. In dreams, a nun could walk outside. A peasant could feast. A knight could fly. Even if only for a few fragile hours. And that, perhaps, was the point. Dreams weren't just messages, they were breathing room. Proof that no matter how controlled life became, the mind would still wander, still invent, still hope. So tonight, if your mind drifts somewhere strange, into a field of stars or a medieval cloister, or maybe just a soft, endless dark, don't fight it. Let it go. Even the monks eventually fell asleep. And if a demon shows up in your dream, tell it it's busy. Sleep, sex, and sin, the forbidden beds of the Middle Ages. Hey, still here? Impressive! At this point, you've probably spent more time learning about medieval beds than most medieval people spent actually sleeping in them. So let's get a little scandalous. Softly scandalous. Because tonight, we're going to talk about medieval beds not just as furniture, but as theaters of sin, shame, and sometimes scheduling. See, in the Middle Ages, sleep and sex were never entirely separate. They both happened in beds, usually the same bed. And that bed wasn't always private. You might think, surely the nobility had their own rooms. And kinda. But remember, rooms were crowded. Servants slept nearby. Children were in the corner, maybe a priest or a lady-in-waiting too. So when a medieval couple got, let's say, intimate, there was often an audience, small, silent, pretending to sleep. The medieval version of headphones in, volume down. And that leads us to the marriage bed, one of the most awkwardly public-private events in European history. When a noble couple married, the bedding ceremony was a thing. Not romantic, not subtle, more like the entire household watching as the new couple got into bed together while priests prayed for fertility. Yes, they prayed while the couple lay there. Sometimes, family members would even toss the couple's nightshirts into the crowd like it was a medieval concert. And no, that wasn't weird. It was tradition. The bedding ceremony was proof that the marriage was legitimate, because in a society where inheritance mattered more than affection, someone had to make sure that the heirs were, well, heirs. Now, what happened after the ceremony depended on the couple. Some nobles dismissed everyone and got on with the divine duty. Others just awkwardly stared at each other, fully clothed, waiting for morning. Because nothing kills the mood quite like your uncle standing at the foot of the bed holding a candle. Let's float to another part of the social ladder. Peasants didn't have elaborate bedding rituals. They didn't have priests either. What they did have was practicality. A bed was expensive. If you had one, everyone used it. Parents, kids, maybe a grandparent, a visiting cousin, and sometimes even the family pig. So when it came to nighttime activities, you either waited for everyone to fall asleep, or you just got very quiet. It wasn't considered scandalous, just life. Medieval Europe was a world with thin walls and even thinner notions of privacy. Now, let's talk about sin, because the church, of course, had opinions. They were not anti-sleep, but they were very particular about what you did before, during, and after it. Sex was fine, technically, as long as it was 1. Within marriage, 2. For the purpose of reproduction, and 3. On certain approved days, and absolutely not on Sundays, or feast days, or during Lent, or Advent, or Fridays, or before communion. So if you were an obedient medieval couple, your approved nights were roughly 3 per month. Romantic, right? Monks wrote entire manuals detailing what was and wasn't acceptable. One popular guide, the Penitentials, listed various bed sins and how many days of penance each required. Let's just say there was math involved, and none of it was sexy. The position, the intention, even the day of the week could determine your punishment. And if you thought lust was bad, dreaming lustfully was apparently worse because you couldn't even blame it on your body. Which raises an odd theological question that medieval scholars debated for centuries. If you sin in your sleep, does it count? Some said yes. Others said dreams were just temptations, not acts. One monk even wrote that if a man dreamed of sinning, it was only a minor offense unless he enjoyed it. That's right, you could get in trouble for enjoying an imaginary sin.
Meanwhile, in monasteries and nunneries, people were supposed to be celibate. But as history shows, supposed to is doing a lot of heavy lifting there. There are records of abbots sneaking into convents, monks running away with nuns, and spiritual visions that sound suspiciously like something else. Some confessors even reported nocturnal temptations as proof of demonic interference, which in modern terms means, "Father, I had a dream. Oh no, the devil's back again." The church wasn't just worried about actions, though. They were worried about posture. Sleeping posture, to be exact. Some sermons warned against sleeping on your back, too sensual. Others said lying face down encouraged sinful thoughts. So, the safest position? On your side, facing east, preferably thinking about the resurrection. Yes, that was real advice. The irony, of course, is that the people making these rules were the ones who slept the least. Monks woke up at midnight for prayer, at dawn for more prayer, and spent the rest of the day regretting their life choices. But even the holiest among them struggled. There are records of St. Benedict's followers being advised to sleep with one arm outside the blanket because full coverage was considered too comfortable, and comfort led to temptation. Imagine freezing to death just to stay pure. And yet, amid all the restrictions, people still found ways to love, secretly, quietly. Beneath those wooden beams and itchy wool blankets, they whispered, touched hands, shared warmth. Because rules can govern the body, but not always the heart. There's a quiet poetry to that. In a world obsessed with sin, even a shared bed could be an act of rebellion. So when you picture a medieval bed now, don't think of a stiff wooden frame and scratchy linen. Think of a small universe, where families huddled for warmth, where lovers risked their souls, where dreams met desire and guilt met comfort. The medieval bed wasn't just for sleep, it was for life, and sometimes even for love. Let's stay in that warmth for a moment. The candle's low, the night is long, and somewhere in a stone chamber 1,000 years away, two people are whispering beneath the same blanket you're imagining right now. Tomorrow, they'll confess. Tonight, they'll just be human. Royal beds, power, politics, and pillow talk in palaces. Hey there, night owl. Still awake? Or maybe you're half asleep,
floating between the Middle Ages and your pillow. Perfect. That's exactly the right state for what comes next. Because now, we're going to slip quietly into the most luxurious and yet most treacherous beds in all of medieval Europe. The royal ones. You see, in the medieval world, a king's bed wasn't just a bed. It was a stage, a council chamber, and occasionally a battlefield. Not of swords and shields, but of airs, whispers, and scandal. Let's ease into that world slowly. Picture this: a massive four-poster bed, draped in crimson velvet, guarded by tapestries showing saints and unicorns, and surrounded by courtiers pretending not to stare. That was a royal bedchamber, and it was about as private as a modern press conference. Why? Because privacy didn't exist for kings. The royal bed was political. Who slept in it, who didn't, and who got invited to sit on the edge all sent messages about power. In fact, most royal mornings began not with a yawn, but with an audience. Literally. The Louvre, or rising ceremony, was a daily ritual where nobles would attend the king's awakening. They'd help him dress, bring petitions, or casually beg for titles while he was still half under the blanket. Imagine having to make political decisions while a servant laces up your nightshirt. It wasn't much better at night. There was also a couture, the bedtime ceremony, where courtiers stood around as the monarch got into bed. Because apparently falling asleep in front of your entire staff was a symbol of royal dignity. So yes, even bedtime was public relations. Let's take one of the most famous examples. Louis XIV of France, the Sun King himself. Louis turned sleeping into theater. Every morning, dozens of nobles crammed into his bedroom for the Grand Louvre. They'd watch him open his eyes, stretch, and nod to his valet, a silent performance of power. Who got to hand him his shirt? A privilege worth a fortune. Who got to watch from the back? Slightly less prestigious, but still an honor. Louis used his bed as a throne. By controlling who saw him in that vulnerable, human moment, he reminded everyone that even his sleep was sacred. And just for contrast, when Louis actually wanted privacy, he had a secret passage leading to another smaller bedroom behind the grand one. Because, of course he did. Now, medieval and early modern kings didn't always use their beds for rest. Sometimes they used them for alliances, and I don't mean the metaphorical kind. Royal marriages were international business deals sealed not by handshakes, but by sheets. When a king and queen were wed, the marriage was considered valid until it was consummated. And consummation was often witnessed. There's that public privacy again. Usually, a few courtiers or priests would escort the couple to bed, say a prayer, bless the sheets, and then wait outside for confirmation. A cheer might go up when the couple emerged. Yes, really. One chronicler described it as a holy mystery fulfilled, which is one way to describe it. Now, let's glide over to England, where the royal bed became a political tool of its own. Take Henry VIII, the king who made marriage into a full-time hobby. Henry's bed saw more diplomacy than some embassies. Each new queen came with new sheets, new chambers, and new expectations, all of which ended badly for someone. When he divorced Catherine of Aragon, he took her bed linens and gave them to Anne Boleyn, a not-so-subtle royal middle finger. And when Anne was executed, her bed was stripped again. You could trace Henry's love life through his upholstery. It's easy to laugh, but for his wives, that bed was a throne and a trap. Lie beside him, and you might become queen. Cross him, and you might lose your head, literally. Meanwhile, in Spain and Italy, the royal bed was a miniature court.
Kings held private councils in bed, sometimes surrounded by their mistresses, their confessors, and their accountants, all before breakfast. One Spanish ambassador once complained that the king spent so much time reclining that his ministers had to stand at the foot of his mattress to discuss war strategy. Because nothing says divine authority like negotiating a treaty while wearing silk pajamas.
Let's drift north for a moment, to Scotland, where privacy was slightly more realistic. Scottish monarchs, especially in the medieval period, often lived in drafty stone castles where warmth mattered more than ceremony. Their beds were stuffed with straw, their curtains were heavy wool, and the whole royal family might sleep in one chamber for heat. Romantic? Not really, but at least you didn't have an audience. Though, to be fair, Scotland also had its share of scandalous royal bedding stories. Mary, Queen of Scots, for instance, was said to have entertained her second husband, Lord Darnley, in a bed so extravagant it was worth more than most people's houses. After he died, mysteriously of course, she shared the same bed with her next lover, Bothwell. And yes, the scandal was enormous. Her bed became symbolic of her downfall, a reminder that love in royal circles was never just personal, it was political suicide waiting to happen. The royal bed, across Europe, carried so much weight because it was where two things met: power and vulnerability. To sleep beside a king was to be close to absolute authority, but also to risk everything. Mistresses learned that lesson quickly. Take Madame de Montespan, Louis XIV's most famous lover. She ruled the royal bed for years, witty, beautiful, and ambitious. But when her influence faded, Louis simply stopped inviting her to retire with him. No argument, no ceremony, just no bed tonight. In a palace that revolved around his sleeping schedule, that was the ultimate exile. Even outside of France, beds could make or break fortunes. In Renaissance Italy, noblewomen often signed contracts specifying their dowry and bedding rights. If a husband refused to share a bed, the marriage could be annulled. But if he did, she gained the legal protection of wifehood and possibly heirs to secure her power. So yes, intimacy was also law. And through all this, the politics, the posturing, the silks, and the ceremonies, the royal bed remains something paradoxical. It was both sacred and profane, both a temple and a trap, a place where kings were made, heirs were born, and empires sometimes began to crumble. Because behind every royal decree and every glittering crown, there was a human being who still had to lie down at night, and however divinely claimed to be, they still dreamed. Let's stay there for a moment. In the soft dark, behind the velvet canopy, the courtiers have gone, the candles are dying, and the great bed of state creaks as another monarch turns over, uneasy. Tomorrow they'll command armies. Tonight, they'll just be a tired, breathing soul in too many blankets. The sound of distant bells drift in. The court sleeps. History turns another page.
The science of sleep, dreams, nightmares, and the midnight mind of the Middle Ages. Hey, still here? Good. Let's slow the pace again. The torches are low, the world outside is quiet, and we're floating now into that hazy, half-waking space where the medieval mind drifted when it dreamed. Because for all the centuries we've talked about, the cold stone, the creaking beds, the wine-heavy abbesses, and the restless kings, there's one part of medieval life that rarely gets written down, yet it shaped how people understood themselves. Their dreams. To the medieval sleeper, dreams weren't just random brain static. They were messages from heaven, hell, or somewhere disturbingly in between. Dreams were the language of the soul, or if you were unlucky, the whispering of demons that slipped in when your guard was down. People believed sleep was a kind of miniature death. Your body rested, but your spirit wandered. It could travel, see visions, meet angels, or be dragged through nightmares as a warning. And everyone, from peasants to popes, paid attention. Let's start with the scholars, because of course someone tried to categorize it all. The great medieval philosopher Macrobius, working from older Roman sources, said there were 5 types of dreams. Only one of them, he claimed, could truly predict the future. There were dreams that were just nonsense, the ones about, say, talking sheep or falling forever. There were insomnium dreams, caused by bad digestion or too much wine. There were phantasmata, illusions from the day's worries. Then came oraculum, a dream where someone else, like a saint or spirit, gave you a message. And finally, visio, the purest kind, a true vision from the divine. So basically, even then, people were already saying, was that God or was that cheese? The church, of course, had mixed feelings about all this. On one hand, the Bible was full of prophetic dreams, Joseph's, Daniel's, the Magi's. On the other hand, medieval theology loved a good warning label. So priests told the faithful, yes, dreams might come from God, but they could also come from the devil, who was fond of stage managing fake visions just to lead souls astray. Basically, dream responsibly. Let's step softly into a monastery cell now. It's the middle of the night. A monk stirs on his straw mattress, the scent of candle wax and cold stone in the air. He dreams of light flooding the chapel, of angels singing softly above the altar. He wakes trembling, convinced he's seen a revelation. He writes it down by lamplight, because in some orders, every dream had to be recorded. Monastic dream journals existed, filled with surreal, symbolic imagery, flaming swords, ladders to heaven, talking books, bleeding icons. You can almost feel the sincerity of those sleepy scribbles. But not all midnight visitors were holy. The medieval mind was haunted by the nightmare, literally, a demon that sat on your chest and crushed the breath out of you while you slept. That's where the word nightmare comes from. It wasn't seen as stress or sleep paralysis. It was an entity, usually female, sometimes invisible, always terrifying. In northern folklore, the mare could even slip through keyholes or ride horses until they were found sweating in the morning stable. So if you woke up gasping, it wasn't anxiety. It was something sitting on you. Let's float over to the bedroom of a 14th century noblewoman. She dreams of her late husband calling her name across a foggy field. When she wakes, she'll tell her priest that she's seen a vision from purgatory. The priest will nod gravely and recommend a donation, prayers, candles, and perhaps a bit of silver to ease her husband's soul. Dreams were business, too. In the popular imagination, dreams could diagnose illness, predict death, or even reveal crimes. Doctors, or physicians, as they were called, sometimes asked about their patients' dreams to understand their humors. Dreaming of fire or bright red things? Too much choleric heat in the body. Dreams of water or sinking? Too much phlegm. Nightmares of suffocation? Well, clearly your black bile was acting up again. Every dream had a bodily cause, but also
a spiritual meaning. It was a 2-for-1 medieval deal. Then there were the dream manuals, the medieval version of Dreams Decoded. One of the most famous was the Somnial Danielis, a dream interpretation guide that circulated across Europe. It listed hundreds of symbols with neat little meanings. Dream of flying? Joy and success. Dream of losing teeth? Death in the family. Dream of a cat? Beware deceit. Dream of eating onions? Shame. So yes, medieval people were also Googling their dreams, just on parchment instead of phones. Now, dreams weren't just personal. They shaped history. Kings claimed to have seen angels or saints telling them to go to war. Prophets and mystics justified rebellions, crusades, and reforms with visions. Take Joan of Arc, for instance. Her entire mission began with what she called voices and dreams, urging her to save France. To her, they were holy. To her judges, they were heresy. Her faith in those dreams changed the course of nations and got her burned for it. But perhaps the most fascinating thing about medieval dreaming is how communal it was. People didn't think of dreams as private brain cinema. They were messages meant to be shared, discussed with confessors, family, or the whole village if they were juicy enough. If someone dreamed of a local saint, the story could spread and attract pilgrims. If a nun dreamed of the Virgin Mary smiling, it might inspire a new painting or devotion. Dreams were social media before social media. Ephemeral, symbolic, and full of questionable divine content. And there's a kind of beauty in that, isn't there? Because for all the strangeness, the mares, the saints, the overactive humors, medieval dreamers were trying to make sense of the same thing we still do. Why do our minds wander when our eyes close? Why do the things we've lost come back in sleep? And why, when morning comes, do those visions feel like something more than imagination? They didn't have Freud or melatonin, but they had faith in symbols, in stories, in the idea that the night had meaning. And maybe that's not so far from us after all. The candle burns low. Another monk rolls over, sighing. Somewhere outside, a dog barks, and the stars keep watch. The dreamers of the Middle Ages drift on, some into nightmares, some into grace, all believing that what they saw behind closed eyes might change what happened when they opened them.
Part 13. How medieval people actually slept. The mystery of the two sleeps. All right, friends, let's settle in one last time. The hour's late, your room's dim, and hopefully your bed is not made of straw and regret. Because tonight, we're gliding into the final stretch. The strange, cozy, and oddly structured world of how people in the Middle Ages actually slept. And spoiler, they didn't sleep the way we do. If you were to slip quietly into a medieval bedroom at midnight, you'd find something odd. Someone asleep, yes, but not for the whole night. People didn't think of sleep as one big stretch. They had two: the first sleep and the second sleep. This wasn't a weird experiment or the result of bad mattresses. It was normal. So normal that everyone from peasants to monks to kings talked about it as casually as we talk about morning coffee. You'd go to bed not long after sunset, sleep for about 4 hours, and then wake naturally sometime after midnight. That waking time, between the first and second sleeps, could last anywhere from 30 minutes to 2 hours. And what did people do during this magical in-between? Well, pretty much everything.
If you were devout, you prayed.
There were even special night prayers written specifically for that middle-of-the-night calm when the world was silent and you felt closest to God. If you were married, you might turn that waking period into a more personal devotional. One 16th century English medical text even recommended the interval between the two sleeps as the ideal time for conception, claiming the body was rested and most fertile. Medieval science, everyone. Others might use the time to light a candle, check on livestock, or sit quietly in bed thinking. Writers described it as a peaceful, reflective time, the mind still half dreaming, the air cool and still. No rush, no clocks, just breathing, being. Then, sometime before dawn, people would simply go back to bed for their second sleep. By sunrise, they'd rise again, refreshed, ready, and probably very confused if you told them that in the future, humans would scroll glowing rectangles in bed instead. It's wild to think that for centuries, segmented sleep wasn't insomnia, it was life. It only disappeared after the Industrial Revolution when artificial light let us stretch evenings longer and wake earlier for factory schedules. Basically, we traded the peace of that middle night hour for productivity. Imagine that. Let's picture one last medieval room together. A small, smoky cottage. The embers glow faintly in the hearth. A man stirs and wakes and looks across at his wife. Their children breathe softly beside them, all tucked into one wide bed, the kind that makes you question the concept of personal space. He gets up quietly, throws on a wool cloak, and steps outside. The stars are cold, the world is asleep. He takes a moment, just standing there, thinking, listening. Maybe he prays. Maybe he just enjoys the silence. Something rare in a crowded, noisy world. After a while, he goes back inside, slides under the rough linen blanket, and sinks gently into his second sleep. And in that small, fleeting peace between the dark and the dawn, he belongs entirely to himself. Sleep, for the medieval mind, wasn't just rest. It was a rhythm, a dialogue between the body and the divine, a cycle of surrender and return. And when you look at it that way, it starts to make a kind of quiet sense. Because no matter the century, no matter the bed, there's always that moment right before you drift off, when the noise fades and the world outside stops pressing in. It's the same moment they knew 1,000 years ago. The same breath, the same stillness, the same mystery of closing your eyes and trusting that morning will come. So, if you've made it this far, congratulations. You've just survived 2 hours of bedtime history about beds. You're officially a scholar of medieval sleep hygiene. And maybe, just maybe, you're a little drowsy, which means I've done my job. So go ahead, take your first sleep. Maybe you wake around midnight, light a candle, and think about monks, nuns, and noblemen doing exactly the same thing 1,000 years ago. Then drift into your second sleep. Because history never really ends. It just rolls softly into dreams. Good night, traveler.